The killer of Indian techie Srinivas Kuchibhotla has been sentenced to life by a US court. The convict Adam Purinton had previously pleaded guilty to the racial slur and drunken attack. Purinton shouted, "Get out of my country," before shooting this 32-year-old Kuchibhotla man, his friend and a bystander at a bar in Kansas last year. Kuchibhotla's friend Alok Madasani and a bystander were wounded in the attack. Purinton has received the maximum punishment for the murder and 2 sentences of 165 months each for the attempted murders. While Purinton would be eligible for parole in 50 years, the 52-year-old was likely to spend the rest of his life in prison. According to reports, Purinton, a US Navy veteran, is also facing federal hate crime and firearms charges which could attract death penalty. Kuchibhotla's murder had triggered global outrage over hate crimes against immigrants in the United States. Now joining us is Andy Rosden live from Chicago. Andy, this techie Kuchibhotla who was attacked, unfortunately, he died. Now, it seems after almost a year since the incident, the perpetrator is reprimanded for his actions. Justice has been prevailed with life sentence to the man who was shot. What kind of message does this send across?
Well, a very strong message, actually. This is as harsh as it gets. He will most likely die in prison. As you said, he's still facing federal hate crime charges that could bring the death penalty. And this case was fairly obvious from the beginning, and he didn't really put up much of an attempt to fight back, this Mr. Purinton, who carried out this killing. He came into this bar where Mr. Kuchibhotla and another friend of his, another Indian immigrant, were having a drink. Mr. Kuchibhotla was an engineer for Garmin, and the two of them were having drinks, and in comes this Adam Purinton shouting at them, saying, "Get out of my country." And then the bar kicked him out. They said, "Get out of our bar." He left, and then he came back armed with a gun and started firing. He killed Mr. Kuchibhotla. He wounded his coworker, and then a third man who had come to the aid of those two, he was also wounded. So there really wasn't much debate over the reasoning behind this shooting. And I must say that's why a lot of immigrants choose to go to larger cities. Where this happened was Olathe, Kansas, it's called. It's south of Kansas City, which is a fairly larger city in America. But a lot of Indian immigrants choose to, if they can, come to bigger cities like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, where there's much more tolerance, much more accepting of immigrants. And so, as we've seen, this Mr. Purinton will die likely in prison. And the wife, I should mention, of the victim, Kuchibhotla, his wife put out a statement, really condemning Adam Purinton for committing this terrible crime. But she also said she wants others to learn from it. She's trying to take this tragedy and turn it into a positive for the community, trying to get everyone to think more about immigrants and the value they have in here in America and to fight against hate.
Yes, and speaking of hate, he has been accused of the perpetrator has been accused of more such hate crimes. Now, a step like this coming from the US to sentence him to life imprisonment, I'm sure it generates some sort of hope, especially in the Indian diaspora.
Yes, it really, this really will. I mean, there's no doubt about it. If he had gotten anything less than this, there probably would have been an outcry, and this really did send a harsh message. Prosecutors asked for this harsh sentencing, and the sentencing came down. The judge was very clear, and really, it was always made clear from the beginning that he was being sentenced so harshly, obviously for the murder, but for the motivation, the hate, the simply targeting two total strangers. And for their skin color, for their race, for being outsiders in America. And the judge sent a great message in that respect. And the wife of the victim said she was pleased, although she was not in court today. None of the victims' families or the victims themselves were in court today.
Yes, and probably a step like this will have some sort of consequence on the increasing number of racial attacks that we come across the globe on immigrants.
You would hope so. And in fact, the prosecutors in this case mentioned that something that happened in Kansas a few years earlier when a man just suddenly opened fire on a Jewish center targeting Jews. This happened in the same area as this shooting occurred. So a lot of people in that part of Kansas are depressed by this. And that's why I think that might have been a motivating factor here for the harshness of the sentence, really giving it to him, making sure that he'll spend the rest of his life in prison, to say, look, we're not this way. We're not these kinds of people. Yeah. Of course, there are those kinds of people, but you hope that with such a harsh sentence that a message is sent to anybody in the future who might think about doing this. But it is a problem in America, and that's why a lot of, I've talked to many Indian immigrants who come to Chicago, and they feel completely welcome here. They have a neighborhood in Chicago called Little India. A lot of tech workers come to Chicago who feel perfectly safe. And it's just really unfortunate when this sort of thing happens out in areas that are not quite as populated.
Right. Thank you, Andy, so much for joining us and giving us all those updates.